I expect that all allies will reach 2%. We have agreed 2% of GDP for defense, and I expect those allies who are not able to reach it by this year, by 2024, that they will put forward a plan for when they will be there. And I'm looking forward to have a plan from Canada.
The head of NATO speaking just last hour here in Ottawa. Jens Stoltenberg is meeting with the Prime Minister this evening as Canada faces pressure to meet NATO's defence spending target. Canada is currently on track to spend 1.76% of GDP on defence by the end of this decade. The federal government says it will reach 2% once it decides on new submarines and some missile projects.
The 2% commitment is a challenge for Canada to reach. We're going to reach it. Spending that money well so that we can reassure Canadians that we're getting good public value for every dollar that they invest in defence is also my responsibility. And we're making the right investments to make sure that we have the right people to get the job done as quickly as it needs to be done.
Rose Gottemoeller worked with Jens Stoltenberg as former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and she joins me now. Rose, it's good to see you. Thank you for taking the time today.
Pleasure, thanks.
We listened to Mr. Stoltenberg in his polite and diplomatic way say, Canada's got to do what Canada said it had to do. And he's going to talk about it with the Prime Minister tonight in advance of the meeting in Washington. What do you make of where that is in terms of pushing Canada to hit that 2%?
Yeah, well, it sounds like Canada has made some progress since I was Deputy Secretary General 5 years ago. At that time, Canada was not moving anywhere near 2% of GDP, but I note Canada's planning to double defense expenditures between now and 2027, and it looks like from your figures that you'll be approaching by 2030 the 2% of GDP, and I know that's been the word that's been out there. Obviously, there are some high-ticket items under consideration now. I've been glad to see that Canada's moving forward on purchases of the F-35 advanced fighter aircraft, and also a modernization of NORAD, the capability in the Arctic to have early warning. So there have been some decisions that have been underway, but as far as NATO's concerned, the Secretary General's right. That plan has to be in place. That is a commitment of 2% of GDP.
Do you think we'll see something from Canada by the summit in Washington? I mean, I think there's an expectation, certainly you listen to the European members of NATO, that 2% is the new floor, not the ceiling, not the target to get to. And Canada's not even going to get to the original ceiling, let alone start at the new floor for a while. I mean, do you think they can credibly go to this summit in Washington and not fill in the blanks on how they're going to get to at least 2%?
I think it's going to be important for Canada to lay out what its planning is for getting to 2% of GDP, again, as I understand, around 2030, because it's clear in Europe that countries that were very resistant to moving at speed, like Germany, for example, are now already at 2% in 2024. By the way, that was the deadline set in 2014 to get to 2% of GDP was 2024. So it's clear at this point that Canada's lagging behind countries who previously were lagging, but now have really picked up the slack and are moving out at speed. So obviously, there's work to be done in Ottawa, and I hope that by the time the summit rolls around, Canada will be able to talk about when it does expect to hit that target. Right. But I recognize those are tough decisions, and there's opportunity costs in other areas.
Right, and there's also the conversation about the value of the metric, right? That you could have economic collapse like Greece did, which sort of increases the value of your defense spending, but it is a target they all committed to. It is a target they committed to hit, so you want to live up to your word. But, I wonder what it is you think Canada can do, between now and the summit in like 2 weeks to close a gap of still about 1/4 of a percentage point. Is there something obvious and easy?
Yeah, Canada has always been a super reliable ally, and I want to note that Canada is handling the battle group in Latvia, so it's one of the countries that's really working on the front lines in the deterrence and defense of Europe, and that's super important. But, it's also, as I said, a laggard. By the summit, as I hear from NATO headquarters, 22 out of 32 allies are going to be at 2% of GDP. So I would think there'd be a certain political impetus there that Canada would like to, as well as being a G7 member, as a NATO ally, would like to be moving with the momentum and with the majority of the allies. So I would think about it in those political terms as well. It's what the leading NATO countries are doing.
Well, it's interesting, Rose, because there's been warnings from business groups, some of the leading business groups in this country, saying that if Canada doesn't get there, we risk as a country becoming diplomatically and politically isolated internationally. Now, Jens Stoltenberg sort of dismissed that when asked about it earlier. How do you view it? Do you think there is a risk to Canada in sort of a diplomatic isolation if you're not seen as a serious player amongst the G7 members of NATO?
There's quite a momentum now, as I said, and it is related to strengthening and bolstering defense and deterrence and defense against a very aggressive Russia, even more so, again, than we saw after the 2014 first invasion of Ukraine when they grabbed Crimea. I've always been admiring of what Canada's done in terms of supporting the Ukrainians, training Ukrainian troops, now participating in the F-16 training, for example. So I know Canada has that commitment. There are plenty of Ukrainian Canadians out there that drive that commitment. So in some ways, to me, it's natural that Canada would want to step up to that bar and be ready to push as hard and as fast as possible to 2% of GDP.
The Secretary General shifted the focus away. Ukraine is obviously front and center, but he also pointed to the Pacific and he pointed to China. And he made the point that while China is not giving direct military aid to Russia, it's giving them semiconductors and dual purpose technology that can be used in tanks, can be used in missile systems. And he says it's just not viable for the allies to keep doing business with China while it is supporting the biggest security threat in the West and the biggest economic threat in the West. He says there needs to be a cost. What does that look like in your view?
Yeah, it's also notable, of course, like the United States, Canada is both an Indo-Pacific power and North Atlantic power. So Canada's got to be looking west as well as east in its concern about security issues. That's a good question to ask the European Union because they are grappling with this at this moment. Obviously, huge market issues, huge job and commercial interests in terms of how to continue perhaps to have some trade and economic relationships with China, at the same time making sure they know that there are really no way they can walk that tightrope, helping out Russia and Russia's war effort at the same time having a firm and solid trade and economic relationship with the European powers, as well as with the United States and Canada. So all I would say is I think we've done the right thing in recent days to up the sanctions, particularly with regard to the banking industry, so that there can be no question that monetary transfers that are in some ways helping to support the war effort that Russia has going against Ukraine, that they will be, they will be under pressure from sanctions. And China is very acutely aware of the damage that can come to it from banking and finance sanctions, but also secondary sanctions related to industry. So I think we just need to continue to be very consistent about that among the allies, the EU, North America as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see Japan consistently coming to NATO meetings now, New Zealand and Australia invited to this meeting in Washington because of that Pacific reality of a rising China. But that speaks to the change. One big change I just want to get your thoughts on is that Jens Stoltenberg is nearing the end of his time as Secretary General. He's been there since 2014, I believe. It was extended because of what was happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, seen as this steady, stabilizing, serious presence at the helm. What do you think the change will mean to NATO as Mr. Stoltenberg leaves, and it looks like the former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is slated to step in as his replacement?
I think Stoltenberg has done a tremendous job in terms of keeping up a stability and a kind of balanced and confident view of the deterrence and defense that NATO has to offer. And that's been of great service during this period of Russian aggression against Ukraine, as NATO has been really assisting Ukraine in every way they can. That steadiness, that just the dignity and the willingness to speak out firmly, but at the same time in a very calm way, is a great contributor to deterrence, in my view, at this time. but also shows the resolve of NATO to continue to help Ukraine. In terms of what comes next, clearly there will be a transition, but frankly, I don't think there could be a smoother transition than to Mark Rutte, assuming he will get the nod. He is an extremely experienced European diplomat at this point, very experienced around the NATO table as well as other tables of high diplomacy. And so I think that he will be able to step into the role rather smoothly. There will be clearly a transition period, and by the way, the Deputy Secretary General role is changing over as well. So there'll be some important changes across the top of NATO. And so this will be a time for NATO to really, I think, in acknowledging its 75 years, to draw on that age and experience to achieve a stable transition.
Well, I wonder what you make of reports, though, that Rutte had to kind of reassure Orban in Hungary, who's probably more sympathetic to Russia than I think a lot of NATO and European countries are comfortable with, that Hungarian assets and resources wouldn't be used in Ukraine. They wouldn't be required to participate in helping Ukraine. Does that give you any concern that you have to cut that kind of a deal inside an alliance like NATO to satisfy a guy like Viktor Orban?
I think it's always important to remember that NATO operates by consensus, generally speaking, but sometimes some allies have great difficulties basically joining the consensus, and so then NATO has to get creative. That's another thing Jens Stoltenberg has been really great at doing, is gaining consensus with leaders like Viktor Orban and President Erdogan in Turkey, other leaders in the alliance, to ensure that that essentially the alliance can continue to operate and do what it needs to do. And I think in this case it was Jens Stoltenberg who reached this agreement with Orban, and I understand that Rutte has assented to it. So I think in general it's a creative way of continuing to move forward with an ally who's not quite ready to jump in the way other allies are to assist Ukraine.
Rose Gottemoeller, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I want to thank you for your time and your insight today. We always appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.